Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another of this series of talks on the history of intelligence. Today we're going to follow the usual format. I will speak for 43 and one-third minutes, and then I'll be very happy to take questions on any subjects relating to security and intelligence. And today we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you may think that this is somewhat redundant because we've all lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we have our own opinions about precisely what took place. And I guess that most people, when they think back to the events of October 1962, they reckon that this was a confrontation, a nuclear confrontation between two superpowers, that we came to the brink of a nuclear exchange, or as close as we ever got during the Cold War, and that perhaps, as Dean Rusk said, it was eyeball to eyeball and the other guy blinked. And there is a general view that this was a triumph of diplomacy for the Kennedy brothers. Bobby Kennedy, of course, wrote a book about the events of October 1962. And generally speaking, people believe that Khrushchev, in an act of folly, deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba and was forced to back down. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I'm going to give you an entirely different version of what really happened during October 1962. And this is based on information that comes primarily from the Soviets. We didn't know in the West precisely what had taken place, certainly from the Soviet perspective, until 1988, when a group of Soviets who had worked through the Cuban Missile Crisis and participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis had been allowed to attend an intelligence conference at Key West. And that was the first time that actually the truth emerged about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the version that I'm going to give you today is based on the declassified CIA documents, the notorious Special National Intelligence Estimate of 14th of September 1962, and what really took place on the Walnut Line, which was the line that was imposed by President Kennedy on the 24th of October, 1962. So let's begin with the origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis and who knew what when. First of all, let's deal with the motivation of Nikita Khrushchev. He was sitting in his dacha in the Crimea, overlooking the Black Sea, in November 1961, when a disclosure was made to him that really changed world history. He did not appreciate that just a few hundred miles away, just over the horizon of the Black Sea, were a large number of missiles manned by American forces, but on the mainland of Turkey. And in a discussion with a senior military leader in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev learned for the first time, apparently, that there were Thor and Jupiter missiles deployed against the Soviet Union on the east coast of the United Kingdom, at two big bases in Italy and in Turkey. And he was so horrified by this news that he thought about it for a while and then went to the Politburo and made a proposal to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba. And his purpose was that he knew, based on what I mentioned yesterday, about Maskarova, about the deception campaign that had been pursued over a very long period by the Soviets in order to prevent the West from learning the true weakness of the Soviet Union when it came to intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so while Khrushchev was planning the very straightforward and simple strategic expedient of deploying intermediate range and medium range missiles just much closer to their targets in the United States in order to be able, as he saw it, to level the playing field. There were certain other events going on at the same time. And the whole Soviet strategy of Maskarova had been put into doubt and had been undermined by a single individual, a man called Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who in 1960 started to approach Westerners in Moscow, seeking to give information to the West. He approached a Canadian businessman, he approached 2 American students, and because of the atmosphere at that time, these reports came into the West of this strange Soviet approaching people in the street, trying to give away classified information. And this was considered to be a provocation, and most likely a KGB-inspired operation in order to embarrass in some way Western governments. But ultimately, it was a British businessman who encountered Oleg Penkovsky who took him seriously. And the British businessman was a man called Greville Wynne. He returned to the United Kingdom, and he said, this strange Russian has approached me and has passed me some information. And at considerable risk to himself, Wynne passed this information on to the Secret Intelligence Service, who shared it with their American counterparts. Now, the CIA was already aware, the CIA station was already aware of this individual, with a good description from the 2 American students, and from a Mr. Van Fleet, who was the Canadian businessman who had been approached by Penkovsky in the street. They had a good description of what this man looked like. And they came to the conclusion that this must be the same individual, but the CIA warned British Secret Intelligence Service that this was most likely a provocation, and that any information that was supplied by this individual was likely to be of a deceptive nature. It wasn't like that. In 1961, Oleg Penkovsky came on a visit sponsored by GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence Service, and he was part of a delegation that was visiting London. He stayed in the Mount Royal Hotel, and on another floor, a group of SIS and CIA officers hired a separate room and invited Penkovsky up to talk to them. And Penkovsky was there for hours on end. A secret recording was made of the conversation. The 2 CIA officers spoke absolutely fluent Russian, Joe Bulik and George Kiesewetter, and what poured out of this man's mouth would change history, because his boss was Marshal Vorontsov, who was the head of the Soviet Strategic Missile Division. And he Penkovsky revealed some of the greatest secrets of the Soviet military strategy at that time. It was Penkovsky who revealed in 1961 to the CIA and to a disbelieving Secret Intelligence Service that there were only 3 Soviet ICBMs and that one of them probably wouldn't work. It was Penkovsky who described the deployment and the range and the capabilities of the surface-to-air missile known as the SA-2, or known to NATO as the Guideline. This was the missile that on the 1st of May 1960 had shot down Francis Gary Powers over Sverdlovsk. And it was Oleg Penkovsky who revealed that most of the strategic missile sites in the Soviet Union, the intermediate range and the medium range missile sites, were all protected by these Guideline missiles. And this explanation gave a great deal of credence to much of the photo imagery that had been taken prior to 1960 by the U-2 aircraft. There had been 24 overflights of the Soviet Union, and in some of those photographs, there were these very distinctive trapezoidal deployments of anti-aircraft aircraft missiles. And this was the guideline missile. It looked a little bit like a telegraph pole, but a very effective weapon. And this was the weapon that had shot down Francis Gary Powers and had brought the overflights to a very abrupt end in 1960. So Penkovsky started supplying information, and in 1961 he supplied information on 2 visits to London and on 1 visit to Paris. On each occasion, the CIA and SIS maintained contact with him and debriefed him late at night when the rest of the Russian delegation had gone to bed. This debriefing provided a huge amount of information. He also carried out of the Soviet Union photographs of strategic rocket manuals, so that for the first time the West could have an insight into the range of the intermediate range and the mediate range nuclear missiles. Now, Penkovsky knew nothing at all about the deployment of these missiles to Cuba. And we'll get on to that in a moment. But the important thing to remember is that in 1961 and 1962, the strategy of moving medium-range and intermediate-range missiles closer to their target was not just as a threat to the United States, but it was to balance the playing field as Khrushchev saw it. Now, from a Western point of view, the very first signs of something happening in Cuba, the first signs started to emerge in July 1962. Now, by that time, a substantial commitment had been made by the Soviets to Cuba, but Western intelligence had not been able to understand the precise nature of what was going on. And there were a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the first sign of something strange happening was the phenomenon of what became known in the CIA as the disappearing ships. Ships from the Soviet Union coming out of Odessa, passing through the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, would have to make declarations to the Turkish authorities by international agreement about their destinations, not necessarily providing bills of lading, but certainly identifying where they were going. Now, these ships all identified themselves as being destined for ports in the Mediterranean. But what was very curious about these ships is that, first of all, they didn't get to their destinations in the Mediterranean, but the Western intelligence community wasn't monitoring that. What the Western intelligence community was interested in were the choke points, and in particular, the choke point in the Straits of Gibraltar, the natural exit between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Now, the reason why the West was interested in the Soviet freighters passing through that particular choke point was because it was also the site of a SOSUS line. And I mentioned in an earlier talk these underwater acoustic arrays designed to pick up the sound, the distinctive sound of particular Soviet submarines. Now, the Soviets were aware that there was some kind of acoustic array in the area around Gibraltar. And so in order to try and fool the acoustic arrays, they would rendezvous Soviet submarines deployed in the Mediterranean but destined to go out into the Atlantic. They would rendezvous them with Soviet merchantmen, surface vessels, so that the submarines would coordinate their exit, their transit through the Straits of Gibraltar, with the submarine directly underneath the hull of the merchantman, so that the noise of the screws and the cavitation of the screws of the merchantman would effectively disguise the existence of the Soviet submarine. And when it became evident to Western naval intelligence analysts that this was the countermeasure being taken by the Soviets, a counting exercise started in order to try and monitor the movement of Soviet freighters. And this became known as the phenomenon of the disappearing Soviet ships. Where were they going? And it is really quite extraordinary looking back on it, but 120 different voyages ended up in Cuba, a large proportion of them not being noticed. And to this day, it is really quite extraordinary. We know that when the quarantine was introduced on the 24th of October 1962, that there were 35 Soviet vessels at sea at that time, and that is a figure included in the 120 voyages. And these voyages were delivering not only materiel, not only weapons, ammunition, aircraft in box crates, but actual military personnel. And we now know, based on the Key West Conference, that 43,000 Soviet troops were sent to Cuba, and that includes 4 motorized rifle regiments, which is really an extraordinary number of troops, particularly when the SNIE that I mentioned that the CIA produced in September 1962 indicated that the number of Soviet troops in Cuba was estimated to be about 10,000. That same SNIE, which is one of the most notorious documents that has ever been declassified for its absolute abject inaccuracy, was an estimate of Cuban troops being in total about 100,000. The reality is that actually if you include the Cuban militias at that time, the true figure for the whole of the Cuban military, not counting the Soviets, just the Cuban military, was 225,000. So more than double, and the CIA's accuracy, of course, was really very limited because it was more guesswork than anything else. Where did the information come from? Well, many of you will probably recall or will have heard about a National Security Agency spy ship that was seized off the coast of North Korea called the Pueblo. Or you may have heard of the Liberty, again, another NSA ship that was attacked by the Israelis during the 1967 war with Egypt. Both of those ships were floating naval, maritime, signals intelligence intercept platforms. But one of the less known members of that particular fleet was the USS Oxford, an identical sister ship to the Pueblo, and the Oxford was parked right on the limit of territorial waters with Cuba. And the USS Oxford was the principal source of intelligence about what was going on in Cuba, apart from the debriefing of occasional refugees and defectors. And the USS Oxford was able to, first of all, pick up information from an underwater cable, secondly, to intercept all the radio and any other communications in Cuba, and in particular, because they had Russian-speaking interpreters on the USS Oxford, they were listening in to the wireless traffic, and in particular, they were following the arrival of a large number of air defense controllers who spoke very poor Spanish with heavy Russian accents, who were teaching Cuban pilots to fly Ilyushin bombers and MiG-21 fighter aircraft. Where had these planes suddenly come from? So the information from the USS Oxford, which increased in volume during August and September 1962, appeared to indicate some kind of military build-up in Cuba. So during that period, it was decided by the CIA that there would be an overflight of Cuba. And the very first overflight by a U-2 aircraft took place on the 4th of August, 1962. And that aircraft very briefly overflew Cuba and was able to bring back some imagery of military activity in Cuba, but nothing of any great significance. Now, you may well recall the large amount of imagery that was subsequently disclosed, indicating the existence of medium-range and intermediate-range missiles in Cuba. But that particular overflight that identified IBM and MRBM sites for the very first time didn't occur until the 14th of October, 1962. So why was there a gap between the 4th of August and the 14th of October? And the answer is that there was a 45-day gap because the Kennedy White House prevented the CIA from making further overflights for two reasons. Firstly, a CIA aircraft had accidentally strayed in the beginning of September 1962 over Sakhalin Island. It was only it only entered Soviet airspace for 14 minutes, but the Soviets were furious, and this was the first time since 1960 that there had been an incursion by a U-2 aircraft into Soviet airspace, and the Soviets reacted very strongly and put in a démarche to the State Department, and there was an official apology given to the Soviets for that accidental overflight. And it genuinely was an accidental overflight, although the U-2 flight was dressed up as a weather flight, and it was, of course, a reconnaissance flight. The U-2 was supposed to fly just at the limit of Soviet airspace and then take imagery across into the airspace. But because of strong winds at a very high altitude, it strayed for 14 minutes into Soviet airspace, and the Soviets were onto that quick as a flash. The second big problem which inhibited the Kennedy White House and ensured that this ban on overflights of the U-2 over Cuba would continue was the issue of the loss of a U-2 aircraft over China. Now, rather than CIA pilots fly U-2 aircraft over the People's Republic of China in that era, the U-2 aircraft was supplied to the Taiwanese, and it was Taiwanese pilots who would fly the U-2. Well, again, in September 1962, the Chinese shot down a U-2 aircraft, and this was extremely bad news because they were using Soviet missiles, the same old good old-fashioned SA-2 guideline, which brought down the U-2. And again, the Kennedy White House was very worried about the loss of a U-2 aircraft over Cuba, which might be seen as provocative. Well, in those circumstances, there were no further flights of any significance until the 14th of October. And that's when all hell broke loose, because the information contained in the imagery indicated the existence of 24 medium-range missiles and 18 intermediate-range missiles. Now, a medium-range missile has a range of about 1,000 miles. Intermediate range is about 2,000 miles. And suddenly, the existence of those rockets in Cuba posed a very significant strategic threat to the interests of the United States. But here's the first dirty little secret that wasn't disclosed until 1988, although it was known to the CIA very soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis. For all of the 42 strategic missiles that were delivered to Cuba, not one nuclear warhead was ever delivered and deployed in Cuba. So when one talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, one instinctively thinks, well, a rocket implies that there was a warhead attached to the rocket. Not so in Cuba. It is true that warheads were sent to Cuba on 2 different ships, but those ships were never unloaded. So although there was a threat from Cuba from the 40-odd strategic missiles, they might have made a pretty big hole in the ground, but there was never any danger of a nuclear detonation. But that fact remained entirely unknown apart from the CIA and apart from the Soviets, until 1988. So that's the first dirty little secret about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The American reaction to the missile crisis was to impose a quarantine right around Cuba. And this, it was almost tantamount to an act of war, because to say that no vessel of any registration of any country would be allowed to enter the Walnut Line was under threat of being sunk, was in effect an act of war. And on the 22nd of October 1962, the decision that had been taken by the Kennedy White House to impose the quarantine line was supplied in conditions of great secrecy to Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister in London, to Paris. The imagery was shown to General de Gaulle, who was very impressed with the accuracy and the resolution of the imagery, and to the West German government in Bonn. They were the only three governments that were consulted. The Canadians were most put out that they had not been included on the 22nd, and were therefore taken by surprise when at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of October, the quarantine line was imposed. President Kennedy went on television and declared that 180 US Navy vessels had been deployed around Cuba, and that any vessel heading for Cuba would be stopped and would be inspected. And if there was any strategic material on board, the ship would be turned around upon pain of being fired on. So this, we're now getting to the stage of a really serious confrontation. History tells us that an accommodation was reached within 3 days. On the 27th of October 1962, an agreement was reached between the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, and Bobby Kennedy. But the terms of that agreement remained secret for a very long time. And the reason for the secrecy was that the Soviets did not back down. Their price for the removal of the MRBMs and the IRBMs was the removal of all the Thor and all the Jupiter missiles without consultation with NATO in the United Kingdom, in Italy, and in Turkey. Now, the United States' NATO allies were horrified by this lack of consultation and by the agreement that was made. And it was alleged by Bobby Kennedy when this issue subsequently became the subject of a challenge, that the Thor and Jupiter missiles were obsolete and were going to be removed anyway. That actually was the fig leaf. The reality is that Khrushchev agreed to remove all of the missiles, but only on two conditions. One was the removal of the Thor and Jupiter missiles, and secondly, an undertaking from the American government, which remains in force to this day, which explains why Fidel Castro is still alive and why there is still a communist regime in Cuba. And that is that the secret part of the protocol was an undertaking by the United States government that no invasion would take place from American soil or sponsored by the United States ever against the regime in Cuba. And that's why Cuba remains one of the last totalitarian states on the planet. So now let's get on to the other dirty little secret of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nobody became aware of until 1988. This is the second dirty little secret, and that is that the Soviets had, in fact, installed a dozen lunar missiles, which are codenamed Frog by NATO. They have the surface-to-surface, shore defense nuclear-tipped missiles, and 12 of these missiles had in fact been installed in the caves of San Cristobal del Norte, and they had never been seen, had never been spotted by the imagery, had never been picked up by the photo reconnaissance. And the problem for Nikita Khrushchev was to remove these 12 short-range missiles without the Americans understanding what had actually happened. So whilst the Americans had agreed to inspect the 40-odd strategic missiles that were removed from Cuba, and some of you may recall the photographs of these crates being shown to reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead as they steamed back to the Soviet Union. The mystery was over these 12 short-range missiles, which had never been discovered. So the Soviets had to smuggle them back without being spotted by aerial reconnaissance. And now we get on to the third dirty little secret, which really did bring East and West to the point of nuclear confrontation. And the details of this only really became clear in 1988. The operation to arm Cuba was codenamed Anadir. It was executed in conditions of very great secrecy and really very successfully by the Soviets. There was also a naval component to Operation Anadir called Operation Karma, K-A-M-A. And Karma involved the deployment of Soviet submarines to Mariel naval port in Cuba. And in October 1962, the first contingent of Soviet submarines heading for Mariel were deployed and were heading across the North Atlantic. Now, the first 4 submarines to enter into the Atlantic were Foxtrots. This is, again, NATO code name for a particular submarine, 78 crew on board, no nuclear missiles, diesel electrics, very noisy, and they were really Second World War Type 21 U-boats. One of the, again, another dirty little secret of the Cold War is that most of the Soviet submarines up until the mid-1960s were of a German U-boat design, and they were very noisy because the Germans were not particularly interested in acoustic arrays or silencing of their submarines. And so the 4 Foxtrots had set out across the North Atlantic, and they were heading for Cuba. Now, as part of the Walnut operation and the imposition of the quarantine, the United States government had put out a notice to mariners, and this was on the maritime frequencies, which indicated the instructions that surface vessels would have to obey when they approached the Walnut line. They would have to stop in the water and make themselves available for inspection if they wished to proceed. For submarines, special instructions were given. And that was, there was an international code, which is India Delta Kilo Charlie Alpha, IDKCA. And that in international maritime jargon is an instruction to raise your submarine to the surface. And the United States Navy gave special instructions that upon being challenged, any submarine, irrespective of its country of origin, when challenged with IDKCA on the 8 kilocycles frequency, would have to surface. And in order to indicate that they were surfacing in a friendly manner, they would have to face east. So they would have to surface in an easterly direction. And secondly, the maritime notice also indicated that this instruction to surface would be directed by the detonation of 4 or 5 hand grenades. So when a submarine was detected, according to the Maritime Notice, 4 or 5 grenades would be dropped, and that submarine should then immediately surface. Now, there is a very significant problem about working on a submarine, and that is that your whole tactic is stealth and silence. And that is why when submarines are operational, they are immensely sensitive about active sonar. In effect, passive sonar, which is the ability to collect noise and analyze noise and separate the ambient background noise of the ocean from the particular motor noise and screw noise of a submarine, that skill is passive sonar. So the acoustic arrays that I have previously described planted on the ocean floor were specifically designed passively to collect the sound. So the submarine itself is completely unaware that it has in fact been compromised and has been detected. Under only exercise conditions against your own friendly submarines would you ever use active sonar. And active sonar involves either dunking a sonar device into the water from a Sea King helicopter, or alternatively dropping sonar buoys from an aircraft, and these devices would then send a signal which would bounce off the hull of a submarine. The return signal would then be collected by an analyst who would be able to take bearings and identify the exact location of a submarine. Now you can imagine, because this is acoustic, everybody on the submarine can hear it. And that is, in effect, for a submariner, it is a death warrant. So that is why, during the Cold War, active sonar was never used against potentially hostile submarines. Because you can imagine being on a submarine where your whole strategy, you're immensely vulnerable, can't move very fast, you are put in immediate danger if active sonar is used, because that indicates that you have been compromised. Your position is known, and the next thing that is likely to happen is that either torpedoes will be dropped from an aircraft or from some other platform, or alternatively depth charges will be used. So active sonar is likely to be one of the last things that you're ever going to hear as a submariner. It's deeply bad news. And in those circumstances, you can also imagine that a submarine commander interpreting active sonar as an act of war is very likely to retaliate. And that means firing torpedoes. Now, the 4 submarines, the Foxtrots, the noisy old U-boats traveling across the North Atlantic, started to approach the American coast when all 4 of them were identified. Now, actually, they'd been compromised at a very early stage when they passed through the choke points at the Shetlands, the Faroes, the Greenland Gap. And as they had come through, they had been picked up by the SOSUS arrays, and they had been monitored by passive sonar all the way. Now, when they arrived and got fairly close to the Walnut Line, which was after the agreement had been made with Dobrynin, the United States Navy approached all 4 submarines on different days and dropped grenades. And this was a really terrifying moment for the submariners on these Soviet submarines, because they now had a choice. They either had to obey instructions and surface heading in an easterly direction, which in effect meant surrender, or alternatively, their position was absolutely compromised and they might be leaving themselves open to attack. Now, you might think that this wasn't a great issue for 4 Foxtrot submarines. Foxtrot submarines have 6 torpedo tubes armed with about 16 or 18 torpedoes. But what the United States Navy and what the CIA didn't know until 1988 was that each of those 4 Foxtrots were equipped with non-conventional warheads on 2 of the torpedoes for each submarine. And the strategy for the Foxtrots, because they weren't equipped with missiles like a Gulf submarine or a Gulf II at that time, because they weren't equipped with missiles, the Soviets had adopted the expedient of putting nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, onto their torpedoes. And their strategy was that in the event of a nuclear war, these Foxtrots would go to the eastern seaboard of the United States, fire their torpedoes up a river estuary, let's say in Norfolk, Virginia, where they would detonate pretty close to the surface, and that would create a nuclear holocaust and eliminate that particular target. This was a strategy that had never been contemplated by the US Navy or the CIA. And what was really frightening about 1988 was the disclosure by the Soviet submariners that when they had been identified and when they heard the grenades being dropped from the surface, these grenades detonated, and they now had a choice, either to surrender, in effect, to surface pointing east, or alternatively, to fire their nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And that nuclear confrontation, that was the moment in the Cold War when we actually got closest to a nuclear exchange, because there was no understanding within the US Navy that that was the likely outcome, or even that Foxtrots were equipped with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And that was the really scary moment. As it happens, all 4 submarine commanders consulted their political commissars, a political officer on board, and decided to surrender. And it's very little has been written about this particular dimension of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's worth reading a book by Tim Naftali called One Hell of a Gamble, based on Soviet archives. And all 4 Foxtrots surfaced, and all 4 Foxtrots remained surfaced and were escorted back across the North Atlantic by the US Navy. And so that was the third and final dirty little secret of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I suspect may change all of our understanding of what really happened in October 1962. Thank you all very much indeed for allowing me to address you. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Yes. The question relates to Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, what happened to him, and he was arrested in Moscow after a long surveillance operation conducted by the KGB. The KGB were very reluctant to intervene because Penkovsky was himself a GRU military intelligence officer and very well connected. So the KGB had to be very careful in collecting good evidence against him. He was arrested on the 22nd of October, 1962. And what is really scary is that prior to his arrest, he suspected that he had come under KGB surveillance. And in the meetings that he had had with the CIA and SIS, he had been given a contact procedure to be able to convey information to his British and American contacts. And there were 2 ways of him communicating. One was by dead letter drops, and he indicated that by leaving a black mark on a particular lamppost and ringing 2 Americans, a man called Hugh Montgomery and the embassy doctor and he would call them at home but not speak to them. He would just call blow into the handset and then put the telephone down. And Alexis Davidson, who was the doctor, would then go out, look for the signal site on Kutovsky Prospect, look for the black sign, and then pass the information on to the CIA, who would then go to the dead drop and collect the information from Penkovsky. Penkovsky was also given another really important instruction, and that was in the event of him being aware of a surprise nuclear attack on the United States of America, that he should ring a different telephone number, which belonged to the SIS station commander in Moscow, a man called Gervais Cowell, and he should make a silent call to Gervais Cowell and blow 3 times into the instrument and replace the instrument without saying anything. Now, what's really frightening about Penkovsky's contribution is that when he realized he was under KGB surveillance on the 19th of October 1962, he rang Gervais Cowell and blew 3 times into the telephone. Now, we don't know whether he did that under KGB control, because he was subsequently arrested, interrogated, tried, and executed, or we don't know whether this was, sometimes it's called the Samson option, that he felt, well, I've had it, to hell with you all, I'm going to bring you all down with me. Or alternatively, the most benign interpretation is that Penkovsky wanted to warn his controllers that he had come under hostile surveillance by the KGB. But it is very fortunate that Gervais Cowell decided not to pass on that warning because he simply didn't believe it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for addressing me, for allowing me to address you. We've got one more question. Yes, sir. Subjects. We're going to be talking today about the Russian intelligence ring that was wound up by the FBI in 2010 on the 19th of June. But first, before getting into the detail of what that organization was and what its purposes was and its component parts, I think it's worth explaining how intelligence agencies collect information through human sources. And in particular, I want to concentrate on a category of human intelligence, which is not really discussed in many books. And I will try and explain why there is great sensitivity about human sources. First of all, let's be clear about how the collection of intelligence takes place through the recruitment of human sources. The first step in this procedure is to identify an individual who is likely to be of use to you. So in the Cold War context, this would have been somebody who was either a decision maker, close to a decision maker, or alternatively, somebody who would fulfill the role of an access agent. In other words, being able to give access to the kind of targets that you're interested in. So having identified the kind of people that you're interested in, you then will require the use of a talent spotter to try and find people within that group who might be susceptible to recruitment. And that kind of recruitment is the result of quite a long but very carefully choreographed operation. So having identified a target through a talent spotting process, the next stage is cultivation, is to put somebody close to that target to see whether or not they would be likely to respond to some kind of an approach. And the ultimate approach from an intelligence officer, from a man known as a case officer, is called the pitch. But before one gets to the pitch, one gets to the bump. And the bump is the introduction of the case officer to the target. So first of all, we've had the talent spotting process. A source has been identified. Then there is the cultivation of that source to try and find out what motivates them. Is it money? Is there something that part of their nature that can be appealed to, perhaps their patriotism, or alternatively their hatred for a regime, some individual resentment about having been passed over for promotion, their talents not having been recognized? Is there a sexual, gender dimension to their motivation? What is it that is going to persuade them to betray their country? Because that is actually what we're talking about. In human intelligence terms, your ultimate goal is to persuade somebody to do something that is absolutely against their nature. And in a Cold War context, most likely, your target is going to be a policymaker or somebody close to the policymaking process, or perhaps a hostile intelligence officer. And these are people who have a knowledge of past events, future plans, current personnel, the wiring diagram of an entire organization, the order of battle, and maybe access to their finances. This is the kind of information that one wants. And so the task can be very difficult, because what you'll be trying to persuade somebody to do is to betray everything in their background, their education, their status, their social standing, their family, their friends, their village, their tribe, their religion, their nationality, whatever it is. And so the personality of that case officer who is going to make the pitch is enormously important, and they're going to create a bond with that agent. This is going to be a link that is going to last perhaps for quite a long time, but the person who makes that recruitment pitch has to be certain that they can command the trust and loyalty of the person that they are putting, in effect, their own lives into their hands. So having made a successful pitch, then of course you have to persuade the source that you will protect that individual, that in the event of them getting into any kind of difficulty, or if they believe that they're in danger, then they have to be persuaded that they will be successfully exfiltrated, perhaps with their family or their friends or their mistress, whoever it is, and then resettled. And resettlement will be some kind of a package. Again, in a Cold War context, that would be the pension of a lieutenant colonel for the rest of their life and a house with a swimming pool in Florida. And that's pretty much what it would have taken in those days. But in today's world, life is a lot more complicated, because, of course, we're not so much interested in senior intelligence personnel from a potentially hostile adversary. One's more interested in a terrorist organization. And then that creates an ethical problem, because if you want to penetrate an intelligence, a terrorist organization, most likely the kind of people that you are going to recruit with access are going to be other terrorists. And so do you really want to put on the payroll somebody who is really not a graduate of the Mother Teresa School of Ethics? These are people who are drenched in blood. They're absolutely covered in blood. These are people who will have detonated car bombs and killed children in Beirut. So the ethical issues here are very considerable indeed. And once you've made the recruitment and gained the trust and persuaded them that you're going to be able to look after them in the event of anything going wrong, you've got to pay them, you've got to supply them with the kind of questionnaires, let them know the information that you are interested in. Then you're going to have to test their integrity from time to time to make absolutely certain that they still have access to information that you need, that they haven't become fabricators, that they're not inventing information. And so again, you're going to have to try and get your source from time to time to a neutral location where you can polygraph them, or give them some test that will indicate that you still retain their loyalty. So the process of recruiting an agent is a very long and complicated one, and a dangerous one, because the case officer who goes to a particular site after the bump has been made in order to make that recruitment pitch is putting himself or herself at very considerable risk, Because supposing the target decides, well, I'm horrified by this, I don't like the sound of this at all, and I'm going to call for the police or for a security apparatus, and the case officer, therefore, is in very considerable danger. Now, if the case officer is attached to a local embassy or consulate or diplomatic premises, they will have the benefit of the Vienna Convention, and therefore about the worst that can happen is that they'll be roughed up, taken to a police station, their credentials and bona fides established, and then they'll be declared persona non grata and thrown out of the country. But if they're not under diplomatic cover, then who knows? They may end up hanging from a lamppost in Damascus. All sorts of very nasty alternatives. And so that's why in the intelligence community, part of the process of collecting intelligence is conducted through stations, or in the Soviet system during the Cold War, they were known as residenturas. And again, in the Soviet system, an embassy or a consulate, probably a third to half of the staff will most likely either be professional intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, or there will be regular diplomats who are co-opted to undertake intelligence duties when called upon to do so by the senior intelligence officer within the residentura, who is known as the resident. And the resident will be in charge of a physical part of the office, which is known as the referentura. And within the referentura, there will be various different lines, various different specialities amongst his intelligence subordinates. And each will have a particular role: the collection of political intelligence, counterintelligence, the protection of the Soviet colony. There will be a scientific and technical officer, and then there will be a very interesting individual that doesn't exist in any other intelligence agency around the world, which was known just simply as Line N. And Line N was only staffed by specialist officers from an organization called Directorate S, which was an elite organization, a branch of the KGB First Chief Directorate, which itself was an elite within the KGB. So we're talking about KGB First Chief Directorate. Within the First Chief Directorate, you've got Directorate S, and Directorate S were these Line N officers. And their full title would be the Illegal Support Officers. And their role was to act in support of an entirely separate residentura, a completely different intelligence collection structure that would operate in parallel to the KGB residentura, but would operate outside of diplomatic premises, and therefore that is how the term illegal comes about. So broadly, when you look at professional intelligence officers operating overseas, you will have the legals, who work from diplomatic premises and have diplomatic cover, and you have the illegals. Now, this is a very sensitive subject because illegals have no protection. And if they are caught either making a recruitment pitch or in an act preparatory to espionage or engaging in espionage, which means paying an agent or collecting information for an agent or surveying for a dead drop or surveying for a dead drop or laying down some kind of a signal site, all of those activities are likely to be punishable with a long term of imprisonment, maybe even execution. So what we're discussing this morning is probably the most sensitive area of intelligence collection. It is the work of the illegal support officer. Now, let me just explain that within the worldwide system of collecting intelligence, most countries that have a foreign intelligence collection agency more or less follow the British model, which was established between the First and the Second World Wars, where SIS, Secret Intelligence Service personnel, were stationed overseas under semi-diplomatic cover as passport control officers, what we would recognize today as visa officers. And their advantage was that by selling visas, by charging fees for entry permits, and of course that meant any foreigner travelling to anywhere within the British Empire